Welcome, everybody, to this live London Futurist webinar, Invitation to Collaborate, Existential Risk InfoHub. My name's David Wood, and I have the privilege to chair London Futurists. I'll shortly introduce the two panelists who will be leading our discussion today, but to start with, here's a few words of introduction from me. I'd like to highlight a number of points about the present age, the second half of the 2020s. First, we're seeing unprecedented technological change, especially in the field of AI, but also in many other fields, such as renewable energy, robotics, drones, and biotechnology. Second, we're seeing unprecedented social change, with long-established processes and institutions being disrupted as never before. Third, whilst this maelstrom of change brings many exciting opportunities, it also poses a host of risks and threats. The set of existential and catastrophic risks that some of us learned about on our grandmother's knees, supervolcanoes, deadly new infectious pandemics, incoming asteroid strikes, global nuclear war, these now set aside unexpected new risks and threats, from geoengineering going wrong, social media spreading horrible mental pathogens, microplastics getting deep into our brains, and AIs potentially going rogue. Worse, this set of threats have difficult to map interactions that bring about extra complications, sometimes called wicked complications. Fourth, and finally, accompanying this growing set of risks and threats, we have more information than ever before about risks and threats and about possible solutions to these challenges. However, much of this information is confusing. It's misinformation or deliberate disinformation. It's mixed in with sometimes naive but seductive wishful thinking. It often amounts to distraction rather than an illumination. And that brings us to the project we're discussing today, the EXTRA project. It's a project from inside the World Academy of Art and Science, and the goal of this project is to identify and amplify information about risks and threats and their possible solutions that is reliable and trustworthy. To tell us more about this and about how more people can become involved in the project, our guests today are Professor Thomas Reuter from the University of Melbourne, Australia, and Professor Ortwin Wren from Potsdam, Germany. Thomas is the chair of the EXTRA working group in the World Academy of Art and Science, and Ortwin is their director of systemic risk research. First, I'll hand the floor to Thomas.
Good evening, David. Good evening to our listeners. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and to be able to tell you a few things about our new initiative. David, would you like me to launch straight into it, or yeah?
Please do, yes.
Okay. Well, so EXTRA stands for Existential Threats and Risks to All. And by that we mean not necessarily only risks that will wipe out the entirety of the human race, but also any kind of risks and threats that would threaten a sizable proportion of the world population. So we're not quite so strict in our definition of existential risks. Now, the World Academy, of which I'm a board member also, has really been for many years looking at the kind of main challenges that humanity is facing. And this project came out of a discussion group studied by Bob Horn, 2.5 years ago. And we started to reflect on these risks and the fact that there are such incredible silos in the realm of risk assessment. So you have reports on the risks of artificial intelligence, others on nuclear weapons proliferation, others on climate change or biodiversity loss, and so on. So there's a huge number of organizations that are active in the field, and many of them just focus on one risk. Some attempt to provide an overview, but the overviews also vary in their emphasis. So we've got a somewhat fragmented field of inquiry, but the risks themselves are not fragmented. They interact. Some people are talking now about a polycrisis, about a systemic crisis or mega crisis. And that is because a risk factor such as climate change has an impact on many other areas of risk, like political stability, biodiversity loss, food security, and so on and so forth. So the risks are really part of an interconnected world. And to look at them separately is not really the right approach. Because when we act, say, on climate change, we cannot just it's not just simply a matter of reducing carbon emissions. It has consequences in many, many ways. So you have to think broadly and break out of these silos. So at the end of our lengthy discussion of these issues, we came to the decision that we would provide a service to this community and to any decision makers who are interested in existential risks and who like to get the big picture without spending their entire life scouring the internet for information and trying to dodge disinformation. So we decided to provide an info hub that is a website that is not static but dynamic, that is constantly updated. And on that website, we provide condensed information on the latest and best available information on existential risks across the spectrum. Now, I'm just going to briefly share my screen and show you what is on our website and talk to it briefly. So that's our landing page. And it's not the latest version. This is a PDF. It's not the live website. So we are on all the social media channels as well. If you like to follow us there, we'd be much obliged. And you always up to date on the latest events. We do have a monthly newsletter, but sometimes events happen quickly and we don't have time to put them into the newsletter because of the lead time. So it's very good to subscribe to us on LinkedIn, for example, but by all means also you can subscribe to the newsletter. I'll get to that shortly. So basically on the landing page, you have a sitemap that shows you the content. And you can see at the center here is the directory of reports. So we have about 100 reports there, or no, sorry, about 200 reports across various categories. This is an overview of the categories. So they are in 5 groups: overviews, planetary risks, risks to people, security risks, and sustainability risks. And then there are subcategories in that. So you can actually browse and you can go into those different categories if you want to have a specific interest, but you can also look at the overview. We also have a sort of a kind of a bit of a philosophy, and this is captured in 10 key insights about existential risks. Then we have some explanations and rationale for why we created this service. Our team, David Harris, Mike Marion, myself, Lorenzo Rodriguez, and Kran Schreiber, and Ortwin came in a little later. It's not on this one yet. Okay. So then we have a short list of just 20 reports, which we think are the best ones at this time across the spectrum. So this is for people who really don't have a lot of time. These are just 20 publications, and they're all annotated and with a synopsis to help you decide what you might want to read. They all have links, so you can go straight to the reports. And that's sort of like the condensed version. And then in the main directory, as I said, you have all these categories that you can browse. Okay, and then the individual reports, that's just a few of them. Then there's the newsletter. And of course, some information on upcoming events. I'll briefly show you the first edition of the newsletter. So it's just an editorial. Then we usually have a video feature. In this case, it was a webinar. Sometimes it's an interview, like in the third issue will be about artificial intelligence. It will be focused on that. And there'll be an interview with Jerome Klenn, which we just conducted. Jerome Klenn is the head of a committee advising the president of the UN General Assembly on how to regulate AI. And he's also an advisor to the US government and the industry. So very interesting interview coming up there on AI, right from the center of the effort to try and regulate it, to ensure that we get the benefits of AI without the risks. Then the newsletter has usually some articles, some original articles, then upcoming events, and the five top new reports. So if you read nothing else, the newsletter, which has links to these 5 top reports, will make sure you are pretty well informed on existential risks across the spectrum. Some issues might be more focused on one than others, but overall, you'll have a very good overview of cutting-edge information. Then there are reviews about publications, most of them academic, sometimes also from NGOs, reviews of important publications. And finally, there are links to some of the top news agents from the world press from the preceding months. Again, saves you a lot of time browsing for top news stories on the topic of existential risks. Okay, I think I can stop there. So that gives you a brief overview of what we are doing. And I should add that the other important element is our events. 2 days ago, for example, and if you're interested, there's a link in the chat. It's a top entry in the chat list. There's a link to a YouTube recording of that webinar we held. And the theme was on multilateralism, or the importance of multilateral global cooperation to face global threats. The focus was the inaugural UN Global Risk Report, which came out earlier this year. And it's the first of its kind, the first time UN headquarters is actually issuing an overview of global risks. So it's very interesting. It's quite a robust piece of research. We had some of the makers of the report with us from the Pardee Institute in Denver, and also from ASRA, which Ortwin is also a member of. And we discussed the methodology, we discussed their foresight scenarios, and so on. I don't want to go too much into the detail. The point really in mentioning this here is to illustrate the kind of work we want to do. So we want to bring together different organizations working in the existential risks community, so to speak, to bring them together to look at particular pieces of work, reports, look at the methodology, discuss how we think about the future, what the different approaches are, their weaknesses and strengths, ways in which we can work together, we can share data and so on. So it's really, we're trying to be a kind of village square for the existential risks community. And also for the end users. For the end users, we want to be the information hub, as I said, but also we intend to have some events that are outreach practices. For example, we have a plan to invite risk officers from some of the major corporations to share their concerns and discuss them, and basically let the X-risk research community know what end users are actually looking for. Also, we'd like to have one session with representatives of the insurance industry. So we're trying to basically create opportunities to discuss existential risks that are not found elsewhere. And we're not competing with any of the primary research organizations, because that's not what we do. While we do have a lot of experts in the World Academy this relevant knowledge on existential challenges, we don't have the resources to do research on a large scale. So we may in future look at projects with partners, if you can find the funding for that. But for the time being, we really are a service provider and trying to provide a space for everyone to get together and share their knowledge and their insights. Okay, well, that's probably enough to get us started. And
Well, I have about a dozen questions I'd like to ask you as follow-ups, but I'll hold the questions. I'll give Professor Ortwin Wren a chance to set out some opening ideas as well. Ortwin.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be here, also to share some of my thoughts. I think Thomas really emphasized the more structural parts of EXTRA. And I would like to go a little bit into the domains in which we feel that we need more work and that we feel comfortable to push for more research, for more investigations, and for better policies. And let me say that we are really concerned about the interactions between various risk sources, interactions between different crises, which we call polycrisis, and how these interactions have an impact on society, on the economy, and on well-being of individuals. And believe that there are four kind of characteristics that make this assessment, but also management of these interacting risks really difficult. The first one is that, again, when we talk about interactions, we normally talk about very complex relationships. And the word complexity has become very fashionable over the last years. And we have complexity science and everything else. But I think what comes out very clearly is that we do not have a full picture of the causal connections between various triggers and their impacts. We only have a limited view on that. We can do it retrospectively, very rarely prospectively. And we can only model things in terms of abstracting from a lot of concrete relationships in order to find the more genuine lines of causal relations. But in general, complexity means that we are very limited in what we can predict. But we can definitely explain something ex post, and we can find out what interventions can do in order to make the probability of failure less probable. So complexity is the first element. The second element, which I already mentioned as a part of our definition, is that all these risks are interconnected. And now we have a transgressional impact scheme. Transgressionality is really meaning that if a risk originates in one area, it will have impacts on another. And it may also be that the ones that are originated in one domain will have much more severe consequences in another domain. So that we have what we call aggravating or even amplification effects that go by two different routes. One is infection, like a contagious disease, and the other one is cascading, that one impact triggers the other and the other and the other, and then each of them can really amplify the impacts. So this is a very important element that we can see, and we can see that if different crises come together, they reinforce each other, and one recipe for one may be a poison for the other. That again is something that's very important, and that gets to my third point, which is ambiguity. It's saying that we had the feeling until now that somehow we find solutions that are dominant in a way, the best options that we can choose. Now we face a world in which, if we really reduce the risk in one area, we may aggravate the risk in another. So there is no easy out solution. Very often there's no dominant solution. And I come back to that in a few minutes. The third part that I would, the fourth part that I would like to mention is the stochastic nature of impacts. Again, that's of course true for all risk in a sense, but we have a lot of deep uncertainty. We don't know really what these impacts are. So it's part because we have this complex relationships, but partially also because all the interactions between risks were not foreseen. I mean, they may be unique when they appear. We may know a lot. We have maybe a normal distribution and the field of one risk, we can really know what are the most likely impacts and what is less likely. But as soon as we have interactions, all these probability assessments become obsolete. And that is because if you add different impacts on top of each other, they may have different kind of impacts. And the one thing which is really disturbing is that the probability of very unlikely events becomes higher. And that's a case why if everything is connected, millions of small things can make a difference. You don't know which of one of the millions will pop up, but each of these could have a major impact. And you can be sure if there's a million of them, even if they have a probability of 1 over a million, one of them is very likely to happen. And that makes it very difficult in terms of assessment. I mean, we always, in risk assessment, we have, let's say, 2 or 3 standard deviations in our normal distribution curve. And we say, well, we cut off after that because it becomes totally unlikely. And then we have a reasonable list of triggers that we can look at. Well, if we have all these different curves aggregated on top of each other, we'll find out that things that are at the tail end of one becomes much more probable because it interacts with others. And that makes it extremely difficult to make a really realistic assessment, and we always will be faced with surprises. So that's something that we need to take into account. And that even gets worsened by the fact that very often these combined effects have tipping points. Tipping points are the ones where before the tipping point is reached, nothing happens. After the tipping point reached, everything collapses. And we see this in some things in ecological risk, let's say the collapse of a lake, but also with a lot of financial risks and other things more, where we can see that everything works very well, everybody seems happy, and then a specific threshold is exceeded, and then everything collapses. So these are the major 4 things. I can repeat them: high complexity, the transgressional and interactive nature of risks and crises interacting with each other. We have the ambiguity that we cannot really have a dominant solution. And there are stochastic relationships with tipping points. Now, all of that happens in a background where it seems that our management systems are very less prepared to deal with that. And as I said, the contextual background is that we have a lot of disorientation among the belongs a population about what matters. So there's disorientation, and people like simple solutions, and so there is a high tendency to look for simple solutions and populist maneuvers. This goes along with authoritarian governments everywhere, and so that if you face crisis, you like to have a big leader, and if the leader is totally wrong, you don't care in a sense, because at least somebody's taking care. And that makes it very difficult to deal with these complex issues. And certainly we have social media landscape in which fake news and real news can it's very hard to distinguish between the two, partially also because things are becoming stochastic. We do have ambiguities also in factual knowledge. And so it's not easy to have the demarcation line between what's true and what's not true. And of course, lay people have even more time or more difficulty to deal with that. So in the end, what we see is that a lot of people say, well, if I can't tell what's true and not true, I choose the truth that seems desirable for me. And of course, that's a pathway to hell, because nature doesn't care what we want. And in that sense, it's getting people getting more unhappy because things don't develop as they would like it to develop, but they think it's only because the people who are in power or people who are in responsible positions don't do the right thing. And that, of course, is so everything that goes wrong is blamed on someone, and that makes it even more likely that authoritarian populist movements become stronger. Now, the issue is that if you look at recipes or at lessons that we can draw from this, there are four things that I think is important to say what doesn't work and what fails, and now we can go back to what seems to be necessary. Four things that failed. First thing is intuition fails. We can see very well from a lot of psychological experiments that intuition is pretty good if things are linear, if things are straightforward, if things are based on past experience. So then intuition does work well. However, if things are complex, it doesn't. And the reason for that is that plausibility in the human mind is something that's close to time and space. So everything that's close to time and space is best suited as a causal explanation for what I'm experiencing. But a lot of the risks that we face today are complex, and it means time and space may be very much displaced from the actual occurrence. Sometimes it takes years before the consequences become visible, and sometimes they are far away. Talk about climate change, I mean, the best example here. So intuition fails, and that makes that people are confused, as I said this before, and since they don't know what the truth is, they take the one that they like, and that is probably not the one that helps them. The second thing is silos fail. I mean, that seems to be obvious, but clearly all policy makers in the world, all governments in the world, all agencies in the world are silos. And maybe it's very difficult to organize it differently. So we have a silo for hazards, for natural hazards. We have one for technological hazard. We have another one for security hazard, so on. So we have different silos, and they all don't work together. Normally, maybe sometimes they do, but most often they do not. And that's, again, a poison for dealing with polycrisis. Because as I said, if you just work on one, you may aggravate the other one. So we need to have an integrated response to the various risks and hazards that we face, specifically their interactions, but our institutions are based on silos. And that, of course, is something that is very difficult to overcome, and we cannot have a ministry for everything, but we need better cooperation between ministries, between agencies, better scientific interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary cooperation. We all know that, but the reality is different. The third failure, which is, again, more psychological, is trial and error fails. If you have tipping points, trial and error is not a good method, because you get positive feedback until you reach your threshold. And if you reach your threshold, it's too late. You can't learn anymore. So you have to anticipate what's going on before it actually materializes. And that's the opposite of trial and error. But most of our systems in society are based on trial and error. I mean, all education systems, we write tests and everything else. The test is good, we don't do anything. If the test is bad, we start to learn again. Our economic system is based on trial and error. All markets are based on this. If our products don't sell, we go bankrupt and then we have to try it again. But in this sense, polycrisis and systemic risks, that's not a good recipe. Because, as I said, we very often experience that things go well, even if we increase, let's say, some pollution or something else. I mean, to a specific point, nothing happens, and then it's too late. In reestablishing the old situation is sometimes impossible, but at least extremely resource dense. So this is the third one, and the last one is that dominant solutions fail. All specifically democratic societies, specifically Europe, but I think also in others, maybe not now in the US for other reasons, is that people said, okay, because we have some kind of economic growth, if somebody suffers, we will compensate the person. And we'll find solutions that will benefit everyone. And if it doesn't benefit everyone, then you better vote for another government. This is not possible in the light of polycrisis. And I started out teaching decision analysis in the United States 25 years ago. I was really advocating win-win solutions. I say, okay, well, we just have to look for an option. And there is one option, which is a win-win solution, on which all the dimensions that you care about will be served better by one solution than by any other. I don't think that's true anymore. And because everything is connected so much, and we have so many plural values, and things are still getting so sensitive to scale, my now opinion is that no, we need to make trade-offs. And trade-offs means that some will lose, some will win, and we can try to do it, as just as possible, and don't create too many inequities, which we already have, and certainly should not amplify those. But we have to be truthful to the population, saying, well, if you want to really deal with those crises, climate change, war, whatever we have, somebody needs to suffer, or we all need to suffer to some extent. It is not true that everybody will win. It is absolutely impossible. And as long as we believe in that illusion, all the governments will lose trustworthiness, and will lose trust, they will lose support, and all the populists who still believe that they can offer this, we will all win, will have even more support. But once they win, everybody will, of course, notice, but very often too late. There's also a tipping point in the political system that they will not deliver because the crises are the way they are. So in the end, what do we need? Well, we need honesty. And political honesty means, yes, we're facing these crises. They are interrelated. There is not one good recipe for all of them. We can try to deal with them together, but there will be sacrifices to make. And we have to go through this. Maybe after a while, specifically things like climate change, if you really make the changes in our energy systems, well, better times will come. But the change itself, the transition, will not be fun. I mean, that's something that I think we need to make sure. So the second point is that we get out of the silo mentality. And as I said, that's easier said than done. And I've been on many governmental committees in Europe and everywhere, and where that has been tried. And of course, the silos always defend their view and say, okay, we're paid for this. This is our mission to deal for the one crisis that we are responsible about. And we don't care about the others. Sure, as humans we do, but not as, people from that specific institution. And so we need to find an incentive to make integrative risk assessment management more palatable, more attractive. And it's one thing is to have organizational changes so that these, on a middle level management, people work together and that they get some incentives as they do that. And that we have good teams, interdisciplinary teams, advisory teams that can show if you do aid to deal with one silo, you basically violate silo B. And you need to do something about it. And I think the pandemic was the best example for that. As long as it was only a health crisis, I think most of the European countries did very well. As soon as it became clear it's also an economic crisis, an education crisis, it is a violence crisis in homes, the system really failed and didn't know how to address this simultaneously. So we need to find institutional means to get an integrative risk assessment and management style. And the first thing is we need to make sure that we have more possibilities to get people involved in risk management. What we can see is that if you just communicate to people, that's fine. It's not possible. It's good. It's possible, and it's also, of course, recommendable, but it's not enough. People need to feel trade-offs. They need to be involved in resolving conflicts, because it's not a scientific issue. It's not even an issue of just representatives of parliaments or agencies to say, where do we want to make sacrifices? Where do we want to put our priorities? And that's where public participation is essential. And we know we have a lot of now, again, hype is some of the formats like, citizen panels or mini publics or whatever they're called. And I totally agree that that's important, but it's not enough. I'm saying on the community level, regional level, but even on national, international level, we need more direct participation by stakeholders, more participation by, just ordinary citizens in order to make this painful trade-offs and to get, in a sense, acceptance or resonance for the need to do that. And we've done this, in Germany for quite a while, and I can see that if we get people together and we discuss these issues, they get much more a better understanding of the constraints that they face, a much better understanding of the problems that politicians face, and that's not so easy to have good solutions, and that they have also to change. That transformation is not just a nice to have, it's an absolute necessity, and that kind of transformation is not for free. It does take resources, and it does take energy. So this is what I would like to say in the beginning, and I hope I started with something that will trigger more discussion and give back to David. Thank you very much for your attention.
Really interesting. Really interesting. So I'm going to drop 3 questions in the chat, which I'm now going to read out and give you the chance to both of you respond. So you've talked about the risks of transgression and interaction between threats. Maybe you could just make that a bit more tangible by giving some examples of that. Secondly, there's a lot of reports. How do you decide of these many reports which go into your highlighted list and which get left behind? What are the criteria? And thirdly, when you now moved from a little bit of doom and gloom from earlier on, but you've moved towards more positive ideas. 1, honesty. Secondly, interdisciplinarity. And third, involvement. Could you say a bit more about what these would actually mean, how we would get real solutions that work by taking advantage of these ideas? So, Thomas, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Let me just say a little bit about the issue of interactions. And, the terminology, polycrisis. Polycrisis is an emerging field. It's receiving quite a bit of attention. The idea that different risks can amplify each other and interact. But I wanted to really critically examine that idea a little, because for my own, I'm a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist actually, the issue is not simply that the risks are hanging together in this web, and you see all these maps being drawn about, links of different strengths between different areas of risks, but it's more than that. They're actually systemic risks, and that's a somewhat different understanding. Systemic risks are risks that put the system as a whole in danger. And because all these different risks challenge the system, the functioning of the system, they're interconnected by default. It's a bit like a human body. If you imagine, if you suffer from obesity, it's likely to, affect your, it's likely to give you diabetes. It's likely to slow down your movements and make it harder to exercise. It might affect your heart, and your heart affects, other parts of the system. So when you have problems in the system, they don't need to directly interact to be connected. They're connected as part of the system, and that's quite a different way of thinking. And if you take that approach, then you realize that there are certain things that are not risks at all, but are risk accelerators or risk decelerators. For example, and sometimes these secondary issues are the bigger problem. For example, I did a bit of a study on the COVID pandemic, and it turns out that actually more people were killed by food insecurity or increased food insecurity due to COVID than were killed by the virus itself. Few people realize that. So you have inequality as a massive risk amplifier. Even in countries like the United States, poor people had a much higher mortality rate because they had poor diets, they were poorly informed, they didn't have the resources to protect themselves. And often they were also the first to lose their job. So risks exist in a system. The whole world is a system, and they interact because of that, because they're all different areas of the same interconnected whole. So they don't need to be directly connected, and still they're operating in the same system. And it's a system that is not dominated by the impact of human actions, what Crutzen and others, have called the Anthropocene. The whole notion that human action is now dominating the entire world system. It's not just the social system. The very Earth system is now human dominated. So that means that in some ways, we are the cause of many of these problems, but we're also the answer, potentially. And that gets back to your question about solution. It's really about taking responsibility. Risk is not an abnormality. Risk is fundamental to life. It's not it's not some kind of horrible thing that you should get depressed about, let alone paralytically afraid, but it's something we need to meet with open eyes, with courage and determination. And basically, we have to take charge of our future instead of waiting for it to fall upon us uninvited and in a form that is undesirable. So really, it's about taking charge of our world. Since this is the Anthropocene, we have that responsibility now. And you have the responsibility to think in different timescales, because our actions have such an impact, not just in breadth, but also in duration. As Ortwin mentioned before, it's not something we're used to thinking about. We're not used to take responsibility for what happens in 3 generations, say, with climate change. Very few people think about what their great-great-grandchildren will suffer as a consequence of our actions today. So that has to change. So it's really a bit of a shift in consciousness.
When you say we need people to take charge, who do you think can take charge? Who do you think should be taking charge rather than just being passive in the face of these risks and complexity?
Well, I think that comes back to the question of silos that was mentioned before, and the issue of democracy. And the thing is with silos, we can't just get rid of silos. We need deep expertise in all different areas. But we also have to have the synthesis, the coming together of different parts of the picture into forming a big picture. And for that, you need cooperation across silos. You don't have to get rid of expertise or specialization. You can't, and we shouldn't. But we need to bring people together. And it's not common for experts to leave their silos and meet with people from other disciplines or from other sectors, let alone. So that's what we want to promote. We want to break down barriers within science and between the scientific research community, the knowledge sector, and the commercial sector and government. So it's about bringing people together, and democracy really is not some kind of holy cow. Democracy is important because if you look at social theory, you'll discover that, people like Jürgen Habermas and others have argued that rationality is based on democracy. You have to have, truth is intersubjectively generated, and it emerges in a climate where everybody has a voice, everybody's heard, and there's an exchange of ideas that's free and equal. Then you get to a rational synthesis. You get the best of everyone's perspective, and you build that higher order understanding collectively. I think that's why democracy is important, and decision-making by teams of people who can cover that whole spectrum of expertise.
Ren, what would you like to say in response or tackling some of these questions?
Yes, thank you very much, David. Let me first say something that I've certainly supports the view of Thomas that whole society is a system and that everything seems to be connected. But I think there is something more to this, and I believe then the very famous book Normal Accidents by Charles Perrow. He made it very clear that accidents become much more severe if systems are coupled, and decoupling was something that he actually recommended. And coupling means that basically if you have one disaster, it is closely connected to another system that is affected by the disaster, and then it gets a disaster too, and that can be much bigger than the ones before. A classic example in which I have personally done some work was on BSE, so the mad cow disease, which in an interesting case study long ago, but it was interesting because the actual risk, being affected by mad cow disease, humans being affected, was extremely low. In all of Europe, 138 people died of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is less than died from whatever accidental drinking of perfumed oil. So it was the risk was extremely low, but the risk was coupled with quite a few other things. So institutions changed dramatically. The US, the European Union started a totally new agency. Ministers had to go. The economic loss of the UK was extreme. It had major impacts, and this was, I think, something where I started to think about how one risk really has an impact on the second, third, and fourth. And I totally agree with Thomas that depending on the consequences or the contextual variables, the conditions under which we operate, these can be more or less. But I think the coupling itself has increased, specifically because of internet, because everything that we do in terms of technology, in terms of communication, in terms of trade, in terms of production, even in terms of political decision makers, is somehow based on the internet. And so the internet becomes the coupling device in the world. And if you can manipulate the internet, which is now happening, you can basically manipulate everything. And I think that's a kind of a novel thing. We did not have that in that severity. I'm not saying that there wasn't before when we just had books or something, but nevertheless, I think that's a new quality of interconnectedness, and we need to take care of that. So that's something which is important. And I see in the chat there have been other examples about COVID having impacts on grain exports and so on, and food, I think that was also mentioned by Thomas. We have very many examples. I mean, climate change has, of course, impact on economic performance, has impact on increased disparity, increased inequity, and so on and so on, and the other way around. I mean, there also is a kind of a cascading effects between all the two and the three. So I think we find ample examples of it. Yes, I think it's good to think of this as a whole systemic interactive web, but we also see that the buffer zones between different risk events have decreased. And that's something that I think is fairly new and that we need to address. The second point, how do you decide which reports to highlight? I think that should really, Thomas, if you like to address that, that's probably more your field than mine. And the third one, solutions. Let me say, well, I mean, we could go on forever, but the first thing, of course, is that we have to have a better way of communicating complexity. And the one thing that doesn't work is to communicate models. And we have done that, and I've done that, and many others too, because we all like models and we like mathematics and so on. But in public communication, even communication with politicians, they just, they look at it and say, yeah, it looks good, and then they do something else. We have to make them embedded into narratives. Narratives that are not simple, and narratives, we have very good narratives that are not simple, but that makes it plausible. As I said, the normal plausibility fails here, but still people need to make plausible decisions. And if you can make very good narratives about what to expect when we don't do X, and what to expect when we do Y, and how that will feel for you and what it means for your neighborhood, I think that's essential. It's essential that people get back some orientation. And if we ask them to even suffer to some extent, well, we need to make them sure that they know why they're suffering for. What can they expect at the end? And if you say everything is doomsday, then of course nobody will suffer and say, well, everything's lost anyway, so let's celebrate what we have. And so that's, I think, the one thing we need to illustrate our complex relationships that we know about in a much better way than we do right now, and it needs a transformation into narratives. The second point, as I said, is trans-silo cooperation. And again, yes, I agree, we need very good specialists, but we also need better specialists for interdisciplinary exchange. Our universities, our educational departments are very good in teaching us how to be a good sociologist, how to be a good physician, how to be a good whatever. But they don't teach us how to interact with other disciplines and how we can get, a mutual benefit from doing this. And it's even more so in terms of agencies. Even within agencies. I made once a study on risk communication and the German agency for risk evaluation or risk assessment. And the main problem of communication was not between the agency and the public. It was between the natural scientists in the agencies and the legal people in the agency. They just couldn't understand each other. I mean, they were totally disoriented and very frustrated because the legal people said, I can't deal with probabilities. I mean, a law is 1 or 0. It's nothing in between. And all these scientists come up to me and say, there's a 30% probability of that happening and a 40% probability. That just doesn't say anything to me. I have to say, do I have to prohibit it? Can I permit it or not? And give me a number and then I can deal with it. A threshold or a standard. And I can see that this is a really important element. First, we need that common point of understanding before we can actually have common actions. So that's my second point. The third point, I think I made it very clear. We need better forms of public input, and that is basically through 3 or 4 formats. One is the usual format that we need good interdisciplinary expert judgments and committees. Secondly, we need roundtables with stakeholders because a lot of interests are being involved, and we need to have a fair contest between those interests. And we need the public involved, and I think some of these randomly selected citizen panels are a very good way to do that. And in addition, we have marginalized groups that we need to address, and they don't come to when random selection is being done. There we need specific formats like forums, like focus groups and others that can help us to address also their specific needs. So that's, in a nutshell, shortly, what I can say about solutions. Thank you.
Thanks. And Thomas, how do you select the reports that give
Okay,
the most
yes.
prominence?
Well, we basically on 2 main criteria: quality of the research and novelty. So if a report simply repeats information that's already available in other reports, it doesn't rate very high. If it's new, if there's really good new data, real new insights, new analysis, then it rates highly. And yeah, the quality of the background research. However, the subtitle of tonight's webinar was an invitation to participate, and we mean that seriously. We are not suffering from some kind of hubris. We understand we have limitations, and we would like to invite experts in particular areas of risk and have a look at our categories. If you can find yourself in one of those areas and you feel you have strong expertise, get in touch with us, make suggestions, what reports should be there, help us evaluate. So we're looking for people to strengthen our capacity. So eventually we would like to build a bigger team of expertise, people in different silos. We have that deep expertise, but we want to bring them under one umbrella. But there's plenty of room for different experts to become involved. Please just write to us and we'll take it from there. The other thing is we have a list of about 100 organizations operating in the field of X risks. We are systematically approaching them all, sometimes in a practical level, on direct collaborations on particular events, but we also simply writing to them gradually, all of them, to get them to feed us information. So we are going to, we've started off with what we thought was the best selection, but we want a sort of a system that's not just pull, but also push, so that information flows to us. So when anybody publishes a new report, it'll automatically be passed to us. And that way we probably can improve our information flow. We also use some tools. We have some AI tools that we use to scour for information, and and I mean specially designed tools to help us save some of our time and pre-select, but it's not flawless. So we're always open to people making suggestions. You've missed this, or why don't you include this? So please get in touch with us. I also wanted to say a little bit more about solutions. And if you look at the main risk categories, the 5 main categories, they're actually a very close match to the SDGs, the 5 Ps in the SDG clusters. Yeah, the SDG clusters. And the SDGs are probably the best solutions map that we've got in the multilateral system.
These are the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations.
That's correct, yeah. The 2030 Agenda. So that's really the best attempt of the international community to map the kind of solutions that are available. And the solutions and the risks are inseparable. And again, with the SDGs, I was on the executive committee of the International Science Council for 5 years, and at the time when the SDGs came out, and we did an analysis of the interactions between SDGs, yeah, and it turns out it's exactly the same complex picture that emerges as we find now with the interactions between global risks. So in a way, they're just different perspectives on the same issues. The one is the risk mapping perspective, and the other is the solutions or development agenda perspective. But really, they're looking at the same issues in many ways. So the solutions need to be spoken about at the same time as the challenges.
Let's take a couple of questions that people have put in the Q&A window, which are both about how do you see this project evolving, how it might be in a few years' time. So there's a question from Basia Vrayet. What is your vision for EXTRA developing into a community of practice and indeed a scholarly discipline in, say, the next 10 years? What would be a good outcome? And if I can tie that with a question from Arnold Bomas, which is how do you envision global decision-making to be improved in actuality based on all the information in that info hub? And Arnold says he doesn't think there's any easy answer to that question, which is why he launched decisionchange.net.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, changing global decision-making is a political issue. It's not that we are incapable of making good decisions. It's more a case, and there was another question before, that there are some of the risks serve malign operations or malign intentions. Organized crime. And if you define organized crime broadly, white-collar organized crime, you might say, corporate organized crime, think of the fossil fuel industry, actors like that. It's very difficult. I mean, we're very realistic about these kinds of political obstacles. And you look at what's happening in the US. As soon as the current government came into power, they left the Paris Climate Agreement. They've distanced themselves from all kinds of UN institutions, from the International Court of Justice to UNESCO to the World Health Organization, the whole full spectrum, basically anti-multilateralism. How can you make global decisions against these kinds of currents? How can you make even national decisions against the power of the lobby, say the fossil fuel lobby? We just had a big struggle here in Australia about setting climate targets for 2035. And the government's really struggling to find a middle path between satisfying the ambitions in the sort of progressive side of society and the fears on the other side, fears that are being stirred by reactionary media that are owned by certain interests and relentlessly push those interests against any kind of rational decision making. So
it seems here that just having information won't solve this problem, because no matter how much information is collected on the info hub, the political obstacles may still choose to ignore it or tell their own narratives.
Indeed. So it is really, what we can do. And as I said, I was on the executive of the ISC, which is the voice of science. Democratically, it's like 100 different disciplines global scientific union of, from anyone from physicists to geologists, everyone is represented there, really the voice of science. And well, it's very frustrating to see that the voice of science is not really heard, or people don't really want to hear it. They want to stifle it. They want to tone it down. I can tell you that, for example, the IPCC is under some political pressure to tone down what it says about climate change. And it's like that everywhere. So the political system is not simply going to act on truth, but there are also powerful actors, elites in government, in business, and elsewhere who are open-minded, who are interested, who want to do the right thing. And it's for these people that we provide the best available information in one spot, because they're all very, very busy people, and we want to enable their decision-making to become better. But we can't make people want to make good decisions. That's a psychological matter. It's something we could probably spend a whole webinar talking about the psychology of social change. It happens to be one area of my own expertise. I've spent many years studying social movements and social change, globalization, anti-globalization movements, and so on. So there's a lot to be said about social change and how it happens and how political scenarios change through public pressure, potentially. There's a lot to be said about media. There's a lot to be said about the political system itself and how it works, and corruption and lobbying and all those kinds of issues. So we can have some of those discussions, but of course, we have to set some boundaries too. But there are many, many considerations that come into this. And I don't think there's a lot of that happening elsewhere. I don't know a lot of organizations in X-Risks that really openly speak about political issues, for example. Certainly not in the US at the moment. Everybody's quite afraid to say anything, frankly.
Well, my own argument has been that unless we solve politics, all our other ambitions are likely to be dashed, because although there may be good solutions available, politics will not reach them, sadly. It is, therefore, one of the key catastrophic risks, degradation of democracy. Ortwin, what would you like to say about your vision for the future of how this project might evolve and have a good impact?
Well, let me first address, I've looked at the chat and there's a lot of discussion about intuition, and I think I should say a few words about intuition. There are different definitions of intuition, and if intuition is seen as wisdom, then of course, intuition may be a very good thing to do. But in my view, intuition is a combination of three things. It's personal experience. Secondly, it's plausibility, and that's normally cognitive plausibility, what seems to make sense. And thirdly, it's also something like an emotional associations. Do I feel good about it? And a lot of psychological literature on this and others. Now, intuition may be a very good orientation for creative tasks, and that has been mentioned in the chat. Yes, definitely. If you want to find totally new solutions, it may be good to think about it in terms of intuition. We also see that intuition can help if you don't have a clear answer. However, and that's now my problem, is that if the contextual conditions change, then your own experience is not a good guide for future actions. And plausibility, as I said before, has a lot of biases and heuristics. Psychology is full of them. in terms of how that can go wrong. And the narrative or the affective or the emotional part of it very often goes in direction what I like, I think it's true. And so I think intuition may not be very good orientation in very complex situations in which our experience may not give you best advice of how to proceed. And that is hard for many people. And then, of course, where do you orient yourself? And I think that's where really, and that's come back to the solution question, where I say, yes, we need very good science that's based on complexity science, that knows these complex issues, that are aware that contextual situation has changed, and now we need to make that a part of our forecast and foresight. And thirdly, that things that are true may not be very welcomed, and that still need to be addressed. And so we have to go beyond plausibility here. I know that there's a big discussion on literature, specifically Gerd Gigerenzer and Kahneman and others that have been working on this and saying, well, plausibility in some areas can be very good. However, how Gigerenzer operationalized plausibility is at least contested. In my view, as I said, intuition is, we know we have different definitions, and I can see some more coming up at the chat and where it's coming from and the etymology and so on. I've written a book on it. But in my view, again, let me be very precise. It's a combination of personal experience, cognitive plausibility, and emotional associations. Okay, and having that said, I said, well, yeah, and I could echo what Thomas has said about that, science has a rigid method of how to go beyond plausibility and intuition. And that this needs to be heard, not because it can make decisions, science cannot make decisions, but I know much better the consequences of my own preferred actions. And that's where I feel science has much to say, and sometimes scientists go overboard and tell politicians what to do. First, they don't like it. Secondly, it's not their task. But they have to tell them, if you do A, you need to think that C, D, E, and F is going to happen with what kind of probability you ever come up with. And so be careful when you choose A, B, or C. So that's, I think it's very important. And sometimes the consequences are so dear that, a decision have to be made not to do it. But it's up to the political system to make that decisions in the end and to be accountable for that decision. Scientists are not accountable. In that sense, yes, there is a strong role that science has to play in all of this. And as I said, we strongly believe that politics need to be enhanced by public participation to make very painful trade-offs. And then it needs to be implemented. And that, again, is not an easy task.
I just wanted to make one remark, maybe to put people's concerns to rest to some extent at least. And that is, I've conducted a study some years ago, a 5-year study on political elites. And I mean, not your standard political science analysis, but as an anthropologist, meaning through participant observation, really deep observation of elites in their lives, participating in their activities and getting to know their way of thinking. Because I was interested in how power is actually wielded, not in theory, but in practice. And one thing I learned is that while much that goes on there is really quite shocking, in shocking in the sense that people would be surprised just how ruthless politics is under the bonnet. But on the other hand, I also realized that the elite, what we think of as the elite, is not some kind of monolithic block. It's divided, there are many factions, there are different interests that clash, sometimes combine. There's some common ground maybe, but there are many, many decision makers out there at multiple levels, and they don't all pull in the same direction. And many of them are quite well-meaning. And for example, at the local level or the state level in the US, the transformation to sustainability that people say, well, during the Biden era, there was quite a push for renewables and so on, but much of it was actually carried by the states and by municipalities, and it continues. It continues. So we tend to maybe be a little bit too pessimistic, and I think by and large, elites are not different from the general public. You have people who are quite enlightened, quite responsible, who have, you are able to dissenter and look at the whole and identify with the whole, and others who are very, egotistical and narrow in their thinking. So
That's a
we
useful
have the
note of
whole
optimism
spectrum.
to balance some of what we were saying
Yeah,
before.
we do have allies. If you look at who's funding risk research, the insurance industry is very big in that field. As a funder, we have some allies in many areas. And there's a new economy emerging in renewable energy, for example. We have allies who also have decision-making power and influence. So it's not quite as black and white. Yeah.
We might have time for 2 more rounds of discussion before we come to the half an hour at the bottom of the hour. One question is another possible route to optimism. Maybe people will think that we're over pessimistic here. They may say that we're repeating the mistake of Paul Ehrlich, the famous forecaster who in the 1970s was convinced that there was going to be famines around the world in his book, The Population Bomb. But he didn't take account of the possibilities of the Green Revolution and other changes which fed many more people. Is it possible? Some people will say that most of the problems we're talking about have solutions by applying more intelligence, not just human intelligence, but artificial intelligence. That if we hurry up and develop the artificial intelligence in turn will improve sustainability, will improve nutrition, will come up with solutions to the problems which are maybe too difficult for us humans. And in this way of thinking, and I refer here to a comment by Terry Rabier in the chat, a safety culture may itself be a risk because we're slowing down the possibilities of getting to these techno-optimistic solutions. So where do you stand on that possibility?
Now, maybe I start with this, David. I'm very sympathetic with the idea that technology can also help. And we all know that technology is a very ambiguous means of development. Whether it's progressing or not, that's a different question. The issue is, do we regulate technology in a way that it benefits society or not? There's no technology that only has positive impacts, or major technology, only positive, or no, only negative. Very few have only negative. Maybe landmines or some are only negative. But the thing is, well, if you think about it, that most technologies and AI is, I think, a very good example, where we can see, yes, it has a lot of potential, and I use it, and probably most of you use it, and we're very happy with it. At the same time, we know, what things can go wrong with it. And I think there can be an existential risk, not for the technology itself. I think, again, we're coming back that things have to come together. And if we have a lot of malevolent actors that have a lot of power, access to artificial intelligence, no regulation, and no safeguards, well, that world could be very, very, very dark.
This is the tipping point mechanism you talked about before, that something may be
That
good
would
for
be
a
one of the
while,
topics.
but going a little bit too far, and then suddenly it's no longer a positive, it's a terrible negative.
Absolutely. And my feeling is, we need to anticipate some of these things. And anticipation means not just to hope that, some ingenious person comes in and he will solve the problems, but that we anticipate what can go wrong try to make sure that that doesn't happen. We're not trying to impede technological change. And I think that's a wrong thing. But what we can do is to say, if that technological change has clearly negative impacts, we'll try to make sure that those negative impacts do not occur, even on the cost that it comes in a little slower. I think that is a price we can easily pay. But at the same time, if we don't do that, I mean, I think we need that balance between good regulation, between technological development and social awareness.
Thomas,
Yeah,
anything
if
to
I
add to
could
that?
say a few things about technology. I think most of the problems we have today are a consequence of technology, unexpected consequences of technology. So that should make us a little bit cautious in putting our hope in more, that technology will deliver us to this kind of utopian future. And this is an old dream. I remember images in the 1950s and 60s, before my time already. There were these images of this sort of grand progression of humanity towards this technological utopia, this kind of science fiction world. And I don't think it is that simple. If you look at, say, the impact of, say, the combustion engine on our lives, in many ways, it's made the world smaller. It's made us more mobile. It's given us incredible powers, but it's also had side effects: pollution, carbon dioxide. It's given us the ability to, say, bulldoze huge tracts of rainforest in shortest possible time. That's progress. We no longer have to use an axe. But it's like Ortwin said, it's a two-edged sword, technology. And in my opinion, when it comes to new technology, we should apply a precautionary principle, which means that no, you don't release things and find out that they are vastly destructive and then try and backpedal, but you have to try very hard to regulate and to make sure that damage is prevented as much as possible. And AI is a perfect example. As I said, we had this interview recently with Jerome Klenn, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. You can have a listen to that. And I think it's like Ortwin also said, malicious actors at the moment is the greatest risk. Power concentration that it will give or that it will cause. The tech giants will become even more powerful, and they're already strongly influencing politics. I think the biggest, one of the early landmarks was the Cambridge, what was it? Cambridge
Analytica?
Analytica scandal in the election where Trump first came into power. Yeah. But now, well, we've progressed again. We've progressed vastly from there, and the possibilities for manipulation are massive. And then the other thing is AI itself. The technology itself, for the first time, has a mind of its own, or will, according to the experts, very soon have a mind of its own, and may well be outside our control and outside our comprehension. So the developments are very fast, and they're huge risks. On the other hand, sure, take energy, for example, renewable energy sources, great. Maybe AI will help us discover other energy sources that we can't even imagine yet.
It will help us to tap into geothermal energy beneath the surface of the Earth, or maybe nuclear fusion.
Yeah.
So final remarks. I will say that after the end of this formal session, if anybody still wants to chat more, maybe a much smaller number, we can continue informally. But the last formal question is, well, what would you like to say that hasn't really been emphasized enough already? And if you're not quite sure what to address, there's a couple of suggestions in the chat or the comments. about possible parts of the solution. Should we be having more carbon markets as a mechanism, for example, to address some of the biggest risks? Or more generally, should we be having a UBI? This is a suggestion from Ian Beveridge, because if there's a UBI, it'll provide more people more comfort, and they'll be perhaps less irrational and more willing to get involved in more comprehensive solutions.
Yes, the last minute is always difficult to put all things together. I think, not to be trivial, I think what we really need is integration. I mean, that seems to be a cooperation integration, I think, seems to be the most important elements that we need to come together. And we need very good economic instruments like carbon pricing. We need a very good regulatory reform that goes beyond the silos. We need a better involvement by the public and by various stakeholders. We need more interdisciplinary research that can enlighten people. We need better interfaces between science, policymakers, and the public. And I think all of that, of course, yes, seems a little bit trivial at the end here. But if we go more deeply into each of them, well, I think there are a lot of things we can do. And also, as Thomas pointed out, we have a lot of well-meant politicians, well-meant and really concerned scientists. We have a lot of good civil society leaders that would like to advance here. And I think we need to have a coalition of them, the coalition of the ones that understand the challenges and want to progress society in a more benign way. And that could be a counterbalance to all these populist and authoritarian people who want to leave us into the, well, I wouldn't say the dark ages because they were not as dark as they've seen. So yeah, a coalition of those who are willing to serve society and who have the competence and the insights to learn. Thank you.
And to join this coalition, please follow the links on the Extra Hub. Get involved. It is my experience as well that many politicians who publicly often seem abrasive and tribal, actually when you get them in their better days away from the cameras, they are often surprisingly thoughtful, often surprisingly worried about things that publicly they never admit. And so once we change the public landscape, maybe more of them are willing to be constructive, part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Final words, Thomas.
Well, I would just like to say that no, we do not have all the answers, and that's not our approach to try and be the know-it-alls and enter into some kind of state of hubris. But what we can do and what we want to do, and I think it's something that's very appropriate for the World Academy of Arts and Science to do, is to provide a forum where we can have these discussions within the X-Risk community and the solutions community to try and overcome fragmentation, overcome challenges that we confront in our work, and exchange ideas so that I think together we can be stronger. And as I said, we want to be a village square for the X-Risk community, and everybody is welcome to contribute. So we are intent to grow and to improve what we do constantly, to learn as we go along. So I think it's very hard to say where we'll be in 10 years, but I dare say we will have learned a lot of lessons by then. And hopefully we'll have grown our network extensively.
We can be stronger together. Everyone is welcome, and there's lots of possible solutions or parts of solutions or frameworks in which solutions can be found. So please do get involved. In the meantime, I'll just look ahead 2 weeks and a couple of hours. We, London Futurists, will be back, focusing on one of the risk areas above all others, which is the governance of next generation artificial intelligence. And that's wrapped up with the geopolitical challenge, the race, as it's sometimes perceived, between China and the US. Both of them are interested in developing technologies that give them a decisive advantage. Does that mean that the risk of AI out of control increases? We have 5 panelists lined up for that discussion, which you will find on the London Futurists website. I would thank Ortwin, but he's already had to leave for his next meeting. I'll certainly thank Thomas for sharing a very fascinating and important set of ideas on something that deserves a whole bunch more attention. So thanks very much.
Thank you, David, for having us.